Well, good morning. It's good to be with you guys. My name is David Black. I'm the campus pastor here at the Town Center campus. And if we've never met, I just want to welcome you. Thanks for coming to Grace. Something that we say often, and we really do mean it, is that when it comes to following Jesus, at some point it will be costly in your life. But that does not mean that it has to be lonely. And so how that kind of works for us as a family here at Grace is that if you are a follower of Jesus, this is kind of the part of the service or the morning where we open up God's heart, see what his heart has to say about our heart. That's what we call this. If you are not a follower of Jesus, that's great. We love that you give us the opportunity to be part of your conversation with Jesus. And here's our heart and hope for you. Maybe that God would speak to you this morning as well. And if nothing else, that you would leave with a community of people in which to ask questions. And so we do that on a regular basis, looking at God's heart through a series or a number of different conversations and sermons on a Sunday morning. And the one that we are kind of jumping back into after our Easter time out together is a series that we're just entitled Following Jesus Living Here. And that series is actually all about a letter in the New Testament written by some individual. His name is Peter. He was one of the first followers of Jesus. And what I love about Peter is that he did not read the instruction manual before he followed Jesus. He just said, okay. And then he kind of found out, like you and I, when we put IKEA furniture together, we're like, I don't think this is the right leg. What? And then you go back and you start reading the manual again. You're like, oh, I've totally messed it. That's Peter, 100%. And so Peter is putting it together as he's following Jesus. And he eventually writes a letter to a church of people like you and me who might be trying to put together what it means to follow Jesus in our time and place. And so this letter is written to a whole host of different people. Would have been circulated around small churches, almost not much bigger than this room right now. And these would have been people with different lives and backgrounds, people who were Jewish backgrounds, so they had an understanding of maybe the God of the Old Testament. Some people who were Romans and Greeks had no idea of what that meant, and coming out of different backgrounds. And he's writing not to answer questions that they have about necessarily doctrine or like truth, although there's a lot of truth and doctrine in 1 Peter. He's writing to answer one question specifically, and that's this: how do I follow Jesus here? There's like, how do I follow Jesus in my time and place? Because what was happening is they were living as followers of Jesus in the Roman Empire. And so that can get very sticky real quick, because it's like, well, I know what Jesus said, but I know what Caesar says, and I don't know how I work all that in together. Not to mention my family may have just disowned me, and I'm not really sure what to do with some of my habits in life. In fact, the life in which they were following Jesus in that environment was very, very somewhat confusing and hostile. And so one author put it this way, just writing about that time period. He says this. He says, in the 2nd century, the church was a marginal sect with a dominant pluralistic society. In other words, they weren't like everybody else. One of these things is not like the other. She was under suspicion not because of her central dogmas were supernatural, but rather because she appeared subversive in claiming Jesus as king, and was viewed as immoral in her talk of eating and drinking human flesh. They're talking about communion, right? Something that we would understand today maybe, but to them it seemed odd. And blood, and expressing incestuous sounding love between brothers and sisters. That'd be weird to the Roman church, or the Roman people of that day, to hear the church say, oh, my brother or my sister. And they're like, that's a Jewish person. You're Greek. How does that work? And so they were seeing people who would never have been seen together in the same place, referring to each other as family, and that was weird to them. And so they started saying, what does it mean to follow Jesus here? And I think that's a great question, because I think all of us, if we were to go around the room, are trying to figure that out in some form or fashion. So each week we've just been picking up a portion of that letter and seeing what it looks like. So if anything that I just said to you sounds confusing, or if, I know that was a lot, I'm trying to do a summary before we get back into it. You can go back on our website. You can watch already where we've been in some of these conversations, because Peter's going to say that as followers of Jesus, our job in our world in which we live is not to lash out, it's not to sell out, it's not to opt out, but it's to stand out. That the way that we follow Jesus ought to be different enough that it stands out. And today we're going to actually take a look at a specific way in which he's calling us to do this in a culture that seems to be falling apart. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, one section this morning, from verse 2 all the way through verse 8. So just 6 verses. It's kind of where we're going to live. If you don't have your Bibles, it's in a row Bible that's probably close to you. It's on page 1014. You can turn there and find it this morning. And we're just going to go ahead and jump right in and see what Peter's talking about to this group of people, about what it means to follow God where they live. He says this, like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, talking about Jesus, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. That's a lot of analogy there, which we'll get into in a minute. That might sound odd. It says, for it stands in Scripture. So he's quoting the Old Testament. Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone. Zion would be Jerusalem. A cornerstone, chosen and precious. And whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become a cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense. Got a buddy of mine who was into cars when I was growing up. His dad was an engineer and also into vehicles. And this guy had an old Camaro, like an old classic Camaro that got handed down to him. But it was somewhat rough running. And as he got into high school, like many people who were into cars at that age, he began to tinker around with it and see what he could do to make it actually run better. And at one point in time, I remember I came over to his house on a Saturday, and his entire engine was just apart, and it was everywhere. And so he had a garage space, but it wasn't just in the garage space. It was also kind of into his living space. You'd walk in the kitchen, and there's a carburetor sitting on the kitchen counter. And I'm like, man, your mom is very gracious to you, right? It's just it's everywhere. It's just kept growing and growing. And the more I would go over, the more it was apart. And I just began to see hey, man, I keep coming over, and every day I'm over here, it seems like you keep taking things apart further and further and further. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, is this ever going to go the opposite direction? And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to get there. And so he was just every hour, every moment of time was doing that. And eventually, sophomore year happened, and it's still apart. And then junior year happened, and it's still apart. And then high school's almost over. And I'm like, hey, dude, whatever happened to that Camaro? And he's like, turns out I was really good at taking it apart, but I wasn't so great about how it went back together. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah. I don't know if he ever got it back together or not, actually. I thought to look him up, but that's kind of weird. Hey, I haven't talked to you in 20 years. Did you ever get that Camaro back together? Our culture today is a lot like my friend. We have a lot of advances in technology, a lot of ways to communicate with one another. And it seems like we are really, really good at taking things apart and not so very good at putting anything back together. It seems like we have tons of stuff that can tear stuff down in an instant, but when it comes to building anything, man, it feels like we're a little lost. Writing about this kind of idea, G.K. Chesterton, a philosopher, wrote this, an author. He says, in short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he has lost the right to rebel against anything. See what he's saying? Saying we've been so good about tearing something down and so good about pushing against certain things that we would never really be able to even describe the thing that we would want rebuilt. It's the consensus of rebuilding that's difficult. Talking about this, in The Atlantic, an op-ed writer, David Brooks, writes this. It says, expecting people, this is not a Christian publication, okay? This is The Atlantic. Expecting people to build a satisfying moral and spiritual life on their own by looking within themselves is asking too much. In other words, it's great. You do you figure it out. But expecting people to figure it all out and put it all together is a lot of pressure. Have you ever felt that? Like, man, I don't know. What am I doing, right? Writing about this political pundit, Yovel Levin, I think he puts it succinctly when he writes in his phenomenal book, A Time to Build. He says this, the community of social media is disconnected mass of individuals wanting to be seen and heard and rather uninterested in being formed. It's a space for public information, not private growth. Virtue signaling more than virtue cultivation, especially for digital natives who've grown up in a world where we have followers, or where having followers is more valuable than following a leader, and performance more appealing than membership. And this platform approach to institutions is second nature, but not healthy. See what he's saying? We're all talking about what we think kind of in this one mass cacophony, which means like a lot of voices, and yet, are we building anything together? Are we putting anything together? On top of that, we have lived experience. A recent publication, 2024, in Science magazine, states this, that an inability to visualize a future for oneself, let alone a positive future, is a hallmark trauma symptom. So what they're saying is that if you've gone through something significant in your life, that trauma actually has an effect on our ability to visualize a positive future. In other words, we live in a culture where we very seldom ever ask the question, who or what am I becoming? What am I building? Where are we going? And in a world that is falling apart, literally disintegrating, Peter's saying followers of Jesus are actually people who are being formed. You say, really? Yeah. Peter's trying to get across to you and to me and to his writers that to follow Jesus where you are is to be formed by Jesus. That as we follow him, there's a quality and a nature to following Jesus that goes against the flow of when the world is falling apart. We ought to be people, and our hallmark of a community of Christ would be that they are being shaped and being formed into something. Literally in verse 5 here, he writes this. He's like, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected, go back, maybe. There we go. He says, rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like a living stone, are being built up. Built up. That word built up there literally means to construct. He's saying, as you're coming to Jesus, something happens. You are being formed. You're being built. You're being shaped. In fact, in our language, this word formation, I looked it up. Here's the definition. It was up there a second ago. Formation is literally the development of something into a particular thing or shape. Whether that be a sandcastle or a wedding cake or a house. Like, you know what it means to take raw material, probably in some form or fashion, and put something together, whether it's cooking or fabricating or crafting, or when it comes down to your own person. There's this idea that we are being acted upon and being shaped. In fact, if you read that verse, when we see what's happening here, the idea is not just simply that formation is active. Notice he says, as you come, right? That's active. You are being built. That's passive. What does that mean? Well, that means that it's not just you who's doing the formation. That as someone might pursue Jesus, Jesus is actually pursuing to do something in their life. I think that's fascinating. You say, why do you think that's fascinating? Well, because we live in a culture in which when we think about faith, we often think about faith as something that we are constructing. And we forget that faith is also something that constructs us. We believe that we are the people who are forming our lives, and yet we forget that there are things that are forming and shaping us together. In other words, what you follow will form you. What you follow will form you, whether you like it or not. And all you have to do is look at these two pictures right here. Right? We've got a fan on one hand. Anybody know who these are? What team this is? Chiefs, yep. And you got some of the most extreme. Like, look at these gentlemen, right? I don't know what they do for work. Do you know? Like, wouldn't you be like, hey, the guy on the right, he's a heart surgeon. I don't know. He's not a heart surgeon, but like, what do you do on the weekends? Oh, I got this thing I do with my friends. You know, I don't know. Like, you know, yeah. Like, hey, there's my principal. Like, what? No, like, these guys, grown men, they're painting their bodies, they're dyeing their facial hair, they're showing up, and they're going nuts on the weekend for this team. That's nuts. That's crazy. You're like, why would anyone do that? Well, they follow the Chiefs. They follow them very, very, very closely. Very, very devotedly. I don't know about you, but I guarantee you, I don't think the first time they were interested in the Chiefs, this happened. Right? Hey, you want to play in a fantasy football league? What's football? Well, it's this game, and I don't think the first day they show up and they look like this. And you're like, whoa, man, you're going hard in the paint real quick. Like, I don't think their wives were suddenly like, well, that's new. Like, I think it was probably a gradual process, right? Anybody know who's on your right over here? Anybody know who these people are? Swifties, that's right. They're Swifties, right? So for everyone who's out there, be like, yeah, guys in football, they're dumb. That's crazy. Well, turns out Taylor Swift has just the same amount of following, right? And by the way, it's not all guys and ladies on one side or the other, right? Goes back and forth. People on this, and we know about these two because these two worlds have collided, right? In ultimate fandom. Again, I don't think you just start listening to Taylor Swift music on accident. You turn the radio and you're like, oh, who's this? And the next thing you know, you're wearing like 100 friendship bracelets and you've got hearts on your faces. Like, that's not exactly like, what in the world? Who put this crop top on me? Like, that doesn't happen, right? I think it's a conscious choice, but it's also an unconscious choice. Because what you follow will eventually shape you. There's a progress to it. The thing that you love and the thing that you follow and get into begins to mold you. It isn't that it just shows up in your life. Yeah, if you follow the Chiefs, it's going to show up in your life. If you like Taylor Swift, it's going to show up in your life. But it's going to do more than show up. It's going to begin to shape who you are. Writing about this in this book, You Are What You Love, author James K. Smith writes this: your deepest desire is the one manifested by your daily life and habits. This is because our action, our doing, bubbles up from our loves, which, as we observed, are habits we've acquired through the practices we're immersed in. In other words, it doesn't matter necessarily what you want to do or think you're going to do or intend to do. What matters is what you love, because that's going to operate in your daily life. It's going to show up, and those habits will begin to shape you. And Peter says, as a follower of Jesus, it's going to show up. That as you come closer and closer to Christ, the more he begins to make you closer and closer to look like him. That's that process, back and forth. Jesus would talk about it in this terms. He would say, we abide. We abide. So jumping ahead to John 15:4, he says this. He says, if you abide in me and I abide in you, you'll bear much fruit. He says, abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. What's he talking about? He's saying, as you come to me, as you and I dwell together, as you have a relationship with Jesus, it's going to change you and transform you. And we don't use the word abide a lot in our language, but it just means to dwell. We would say to sit in, to sit with, to be with, to hang out with, to know. All of those words would be in that circumstance. Richard Lovelace, who talks about spiritual formation, would agree He says this, that when it comes to looking like Jesus, spiritual life flows out of union with Christ, not merely imitation of Christ. In other words, I'm not just going to do what he did. I'm actually going to spend time with him. I'm going to read his words and how he thinks. I want to know how he thinks. Right? This is why the more you hang out with a friend who's into something, the more, like it or not, you're going to learn about that. You're going to start thinking like your friend thinks. You're going to start hearing what they like, what they love. And eventually, at some point in time, you're going to pick that up. So if you were having another conversation with another person in your life, and they were talking about the hobby that your friend was into, you actually might be able to contribute to that. Why? Because you're into it? No, because my friend's into it, and I hear about it. It comes out. That's how it works. If you've been married for 20 years, and your coworkers find out about your wife next month, that's a problem, right? Why? Because you have not been mentioning her. You fail to mention you're married. You fail to mention you've got kids, right? Like, what? Why? It just never came up. Yeah, I know. It's like, hey, it's in your life. It comes out through you. That's how it works. The same with spiritual formation. And notice Peter says, you're being built into a spiritual house. Now, he's referring to the temple, or the temple in Jerusalem, which they would have worshiped the Lord there and gone to be with God there. That's what the people would have done. We're going to go to meet God at the temple. And he's going, no, you guys are becoming a house where that happens. And why does that matter? Well, because I think there's a vein in Christianity, right, where maybe you were taught growing up that God has a house for you in eternity, and if you follow him here, that's kind of where you end up, and one day, someday, you'll be with him. And I'm not saying that there are not parts about that. That is correct. But what I think we forget is that God is not interested in just building you a house one day, someday, in eternity. God is interested in building your life here into a house in which he wants to come and move in with and live. He wants to be with you. God has an agenda. And for some of us, that's the issue, because we have an agenda. And those things are at odds at some times. That as you come to God, as you come to Jesus, the closer you get to Jesus, the more you follow him, the more he will begin to form you here and now. You say, okay, well, that's great. But what does that look like? What does that look like? I think Peter gives us 3 examples, 3 ways that formation shows up in our life as we come to Christ. And so I'm not saying that you're here and you're close to Christ. You might be going, I've never really thought about what I'm becoming like. Some of us, we're here and we've said, well, as I come to church, and again, just because you come to church does not mean that you're coming close to Jesus. Right? Well, I've come to understand a few things, and that's okay, because at some point, we're all moving one way or another. There's no standing still. We're either moving toward Jesus or moving away from Jesus. There's no I'm just been kind of stuck in this spot. We're moving towards, moving away. And what Peter says, one of the ways that you see this formation begin to happen in your life and to show up is in 3 specific things, and he mentions them all here. The first one he says is this, that the way formation shows up in your life is community. It's community. Notice he says, as you come to Christ, him, a living stone rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. That idea of you there is not individual. It's y'all in the Greek. It's plural. You yourselves, all y'all. That's what he's saying. He's saying as y'all come to him, all y'all are being built together to look like him. In other words, formation is not a solo sport. And this is true whether it's Jesus or somebody else. That as you're formed by what you follow, you begin to find others who are following the same thing and being formed in the same way. He's saying as you follow Jesus, a certain community begins to show up. He says you guys are like living stones. That's a weird illustration. What does that mean? Well, he means stones that are alive. There you go. He's like, it's like people who are blocks. It's like Lego people, but not Lego people. It's people who are Legos, right? Like that idea of bricks. In fact, in that day and age, a stone would have been the most natural building material. We wouldn't necessarily think of it that way. We might think of it as a brick. But he has in mind these giant stones. In fact, if you go and tour the ancient world, you'd find things made of giant stone that we still have. He's going, they've been put together and interlocked together, a lot like this right here. And so he's like, what's happening is that as you show up to Jesus, you find others who are showing up to Jesus, and you begin to have this interdependency and this community. That's what happens. And so like my wife and I, we like to go to concerts lately. And so we've gone to a couple concerts. Recently, we went to one of a band that we like, and down in Atlanta. And when we showed up, we were not shocked to find out that there were other people there. We showed up at that band's venue that they rented, and we weren't like, who are all these people? We were like, oh, there are more people here. We expected that. In fact, if you showed up to a concert and expected to be the only one, we would go, what did you think you were doing? Did you think you were the only one who was following this group? Now, that stinks for the band if you are the only one, right? Because then they realize, oh, we don't have a what? A following. We don't have a following. And so as I follow Jesus, sometimes I might get annoyed that there are other people at the show. But what else did we expect, right? As I follow Jesus, I ought to expect that there might be other people who are following Jesus. By the way, people that I don't get to choose who gets to be there. The qualification is follow Jesus. And that begins to be problematic, which we'll see in a second, right? But there ought to be this assumption that as I'm being formed by Jesus, I'm actually being brought into a community that's being formed. And that community that's being formed has a quality and a nature like Jesus too. Have you ever just seen a brick that's off by itself laying on the ground? Look at this one. Isn't that sad? You see a brick like that, you either want to throw it away or pick it up and be like, it's okay, guy. It's all right. We'll find you a house, right? I have a brick like this on the front steps. The mortar has come off, and it just flops over. And I pick it up, and I put it back, and I walk inside. I have yet to actually fix it there, right? But I'm like, oh, someone knocked it over. Put it back. Oh, someone knocked it. It just keeps, it's like, let me be free. It just wants to jump out. And I'm like, that's not where you belong. You belong attached. You belong as part of a whole. And that's what Peter's trying to get across to them. He's saying, as you follow Jesus, God will begin to form you such that you begin to belong to part of a whole of people who are following Jesus, often people who you would not have picked. In fact, salvation, coming to Jesus, is an addition process. In fact, we see that in the early church. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, we saw one of the first and largest sermons ever given. 3,000 people were added to their number. And so right here in Acts chapter 2, verse 21, it says, so those who received his word and were baptized, they were added to that day about 3,000 souls. And so instantly, that concert got a lot bigger. 3,000 people. They're like, whoa, where did you guys come from? Who let you in? It's like, Jesus. Oh, I guess that's okay. Yeah. He didn't really ask me first, but I guess it's his show, right? That's how it works. That's how it works. Acts 5:14, they begin to talk about this. And more than ever, believers were being added to the Lord, multitudes, both men and women. Hey, God just keeps adding and adding and adding and adding and adding. Why? Because different people from different walks of life who don't think like us, vote like us, or look like us, begin to respond to Jesus. And God begins to build a community that looks like him. And he is forming it. He's forming it. Not the pastor, right? It's not a political thing. It's not a national thing. It's not a people that are economic. It's not an economical thing. It is a Jesus thing that he is building and beginning to put together. Now, this is problematic for us because most of us function off of something called social exchange theory. Started in the 1970s. It didn't start. It was talked about in the 1970s by a guy named Richard Emerson. And what he began to observe is that most people in the West use and function within relationships based off of what the other person requires from them and what they get back. And so what Richard Emerson began to say and observe is that each one of us keeps a little accounting ledger in our mind or our heart of a person. And we think, okay, they showed up at my house and my party, +2. Oh man, they parked on my grass, -3. Oh man, they need help moving, -20, right? They made me cookies, positive 50. Like we're constantly doing this in our life. They said, what about me? minus 5, right? It's like we're doing our own accounting. We're like the IRS of relationships. That's what Richard Emerson would say. And he says there's a point in which we have to decide whether we are getting as much as we are putting into this. And oftentimes what we do is we say, hey, the natural progression of all of this is that we are going to hang out with people who put into our lives. Now, there's some health and truth to that, right? You need people around you who, when you're with them, you walk away feeling somewhat refreshed, and they're helpful, and they're helping you grow, and you feel great. But also, the problem that comes up with this, in Richard Emerson's word, not a follower of Jesus, just a sociologist, here's what he says. Throughout the theory, we also end up losing relationships that we had because we gradually feel they are no longer beneficial to us in any way. We feel like there is no longer any point of having any type of communication because there aren't any rewards anymore. That's difficult for church world, right? Because if I don't get to pick who comes in and I don't get to see, if Jesus is forming it, that means that there are going to be people who invest a lot in my life and I feel great. And it means there are also going to be times that when I'm there, I just feel like they're taking and taking and taking. What do I do? How does that function? And Peter goes, yeah, this is something God's doing. It's not your accounts. It means it's going to be difficult. The hardest thing about church is people. If you have hurt from church, it's people. We've all been wounded and hurt by people. I'm not dismissing that. I'm not ignoring that. But I'm saying you're not alone in that. Right? 100%. As a pastor, I've been hurt by the church. I've also hurt people. Right? I'm not saying intentionally, but we have to realize that when we get close to one another and God is building something, there's a nature to which it's not going to always equal out. And yet, Peter's saying you're being built into a spiritual house in which God can dwell and hang out in and know. Church is a byproduct of following Jesus. The community is a byproduct of people coming to Christ. Like, who came up with this? Jesus. Who loves this? Jesus. Who's in charge of this? Jesus. Someone should feed this thing. Well, Jesus does. Who cares for this? Jesus. Who's going to ever come back and pick up this thing? Jesus. Who would marry this wife? Jesus. Right? That's what he does. He's invested his time, his life, his energy. Literally, he invented it and came up with it. He's building it. Right? He's saying, as you come to me, I'm going to create a community, and that community is not only going to show up in your life, it's going to form you. In fact, talking about this in Ephesians 4, Paul writes this to a church that had a lot of problems. It wasn't perfect. He says this, he, God, makes the whole body, that's the church, fit together perfectly as each part does its own special work. It helps the other parts grow so that the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. That's what God is trying to do in us. It's the idea. It's formation. So if we follow Jesus, we ought to find that there's a community of Jesus that we're following him with. Doesn't have to be this one, doesn't have to be the one that you grew up in, doesn't have to be the one that your parents want for you, doesn't have to be the one that your friend, it has to be, there's got to be something, right? There's got to be a community there that is being formed around this. And again, he's not saying as you come to politics, as you come to music, as you come to a charismatic leader. He's saying as you come to Jesus. In fact, there's a stability. It's not just a community that shows up in this formation. One of the hallmarks of the formation of Jesus is that there is a stability in your life. He says, look, you're coming to Jesus, who was the first stone. He says this in this verse right here. He says, you're coming to him, a living stone, Jesus, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You, like other living stones, are being built. What's he describing there? A foundation. He's saying Jesus, later on he'll call him the cornerstone. And the cornerstone is a literal building technique where you would place a block. It is the first block placed, and that block would be level, left to right, east to west, side to side. That block would be set to the degree and the place that you want it, such that every other block that you put down would have reference off of that block. So that's the block, that's the level, that's where we want. If that doesn't happen, what you get is this, right? In a very small sense, have you ever tried to put up a shelf in your house and you level the shelf and you go, well, I know the shelf is level. What's wrong? The house is not. And then you have to decide, do I put the crooked shelf level with the house? Well, that's a tough one for me, man. No one will know. I'll know, right? It's like, what do I do? You know what? You start thinking to yourself, who built this house? If they had built this level, this would have been a lot easier for me, right? Yeah, you're not the first person to think about that. We have a famous example of that right here as well. Again, level is very important. A foundation is not just simply about strength, it's about where you start and how you start. And what Peter is saying is that the formation for a follower of Jesus' life starts with a solid, set stone that everything else comes off of. So that as God begins to form you and shape you, your formation is shaped and formed based off of Jesus. So I look at him and I go, okay, is it when it comes to my family or my time or my work or my enjoyment, my hobbies, I want God's going to line up my life. I want to cooperate with God as he lines up my life in level with what Jesus is, how Jesus thinks about those things and approaches those things. I want my habits to be shaped. I want them to be in line and in relationship to Jesus. I want my finances to be in relationship to Jesus. I want my marriage to be in the same attitude and level as Jesus. I want my parenting to be lined up and with Jesus. Why? Because I'm legalistic? No. I just want something that's stable. I want God to build into me and to shape me off of that. Right? All formation is a response to a reality. Taylor Swift is a really good singer. Oh my goodness. Well, let's just pray. Guys, I went camping. I slept on the ground for 3 days. That church was great. Taylor Swift is a really good singer. They're just responding to that reality, just more than you would. The Chiefs are an okay football team. Those guys, you're like, what's with them? They're responding to that reality in a way that you never thought you would and you think is a little extreme. Right? You see, it's not about rules. The Chiefs didn't go, everyone dye your facial hair red and yellow this weekend or be kicked out. That's not how that works. That's not how that works. But you know that in relationships, there are things that happen. Like, oh, their colors are red and yellow. What would happen if a Chiefs fan showed up in Packer gold and green dyed facial hair? They would be asked to leave. Why? Because the rules say no. Because it's like, this is the relationship. Who do you think you're in a relationship with, right? Like, I'm married. There are things that I've learned about my wife that she likes, preferences that she would have, right? And early on, I didn't pick up on some of those. But now that we've been together for a while, I know those, right? Are there rules? No, but I don't get to just treat her however I want. What? As a good husband, I might think, man, I want to treat her the way that she would like to be treated. I want to structure my life and my relationship with her. I want to respond to the reality of the things that she loves and who she is. And as we do that, our marriage is formed and shaped. A follower of Jesus is responding to the reality of Jesus in every area of their life and putting it together such that it begins to look like him. And God assists in this, by the way. What Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 3 is that Jesus is the thing for followers of Jesus. Like, don't form your life in response to other stuff. Follow it and form it in response to Jesus. He says this, as a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it, talking about Jesus. For no one can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. He's saying this is it. For followers of Jesus, we're responding to that, and that's forming us. By the way, if you're not a follower of Jesus, that's okay. You can, as we said, you don't have to follow Jesus to come here. But you, by the way, are also responding to realities in your life. It's not a question of if you're being formed, it's what are you being formed by. Talking about this, John Mark Comer in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, says this: what you give your attention to is the person you become. That bodes well for those apprentices of Jesus who give the bulk of their attention to him and to all that is good, beautiful, and true in this world. But for those who give their attention to the 24/7 news cycle of outrage and anxiety and emotionally changed drama and the nonstop feed of celebrity gossip, titillation, and cultural drivel, that's not great. It's not healthy. See, you are being formed right now, today, by something you are following. And others are being formed by what you're following, by the way, because they're following you, whether you like it or not. All of us are being shaped by something, and yet we seldom stop to think and ask, what am I becoming? Who am I becoming? Peter says, as you come to Christ, collectively we're being formed and shaped and responding to that reality. Now, what I find is fascinating is Peter's nickname, literally the name Peter was a nickname given by Jesus, which means rock. And he could have easily been like, I'm the rock. That's me. In my life, you know what my foundation is? Me. Why? Because I'm the rock. But the guy whose nickname is the rock, who gave him the rock nickname, by the way? Jesus. I'd say he's pretty good at giving nicknames. If Jesus gives you a nickname, I don't know if you can argue with it, right? It's like, hey, I made you, I know you, this is your nickname. I don't like it. I think it's right? So Jesus looks at Peter and goes, you're the rock. He had a lot to boast in, but Peter goes, you know what? My name, whose nickname is the rock, I want to talk to you about the actual rock, right? I want to talk to you about a different stone. Jesus. That's the one that I'm building my life upon and shaping my life around. It's community, stability. Last one is this, your identity. Notice he says in verse 6, as we come to him as living stones rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house. What? To be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. He's saying God is not just haphazardly forming you into something. He's not just making it up as he goes along. I don't know. If you went to college at some point in time, someone might have asked you the question, what are you in school for? And if you're a freshman, you're like, I don't know. My parents thought it was a good idea. Or maybe you said, I'm in school for nursing, or I'm in school for engineering, or I'm undecided, or we'll figure it out. Why? Because people are they're assuming that you don't just go to college and go, They're assuming that you have an objective in mind. Jesus has an objective in mind as he's forming you. He's like, you're going to be a priest. I don't like collars. That's not what he means, right? He's not saying, hey, I want you to be a pastor. Your job is to be a pastor forever. That's not how that works. A priest is someone who lived their life in service to God and service to others. Their job was to be in the house, the temple, where God was, and be in such relationship with him that they served God, and they also helped others know him. And he's saying Jesus is in the business of taking you and me and forming us into that. That's what we're in school for. By the way, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, when God is talking about making man, we're told that God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and to keep it. Why do those two words matter? Because that's the exact same words in Hebrew that God would later describe is the job of the priest. What's happening there? Oh, Adam and Eve are priests. God makes a garden, he makes a world, he makes you and I, and he looks at Adam and Eve and goes, your job is to be in service to me and service to one another. That's all he's been trying to do since then, is to make us into people who literally offer sacrifices to God. You say like physical sacrifice? No, like our life, our time, our money, our energy, all of it, giving it back to God. That's what we're to do. I don't know how you feel about self-checkouts. I feel a certain way, probably because I'm 43. If you're younger, you're probably like, I don't have to talk to anybody. Yes. Right? But I just don't like doing it myself, right? It's okay at Kroger, I get that, but if you go to Home Depot, there's a ton of self-checkouts. And I'm like, I have a 4x8 piece of lumber. You want me to check this out? Why am I paying you money? Right? Because I'm older. I'm like, that's whose job? Your job. You're the store. You should, what am I paying you for, right? Because I don't like that, right? But now that's the reason I don't like that is because I am a consumer. And I want things the way that I want them. And I'm paying things a certain way or a certain price so that they would meet me where I am and help me meet my needs. And one of my needs is that I don't have to carry a 4x8 piece of lumber over a scanner. I don't want to bag my own, screws and nails. You're like, well, that's just because you're old. Well, fine. But this is a free market capitalist economy, and I would really like someone else to change that, right? And I could vote with my feet. Right? That's not how it works in the kingdom of God. There is no, you do it for me. There is no, you're the person, you do the Jesus stuff. What he's saying is that all of us are being made into people who serve God directly and serve others. Right? This is not about consuming. This is about actually loving Jesus and loving other people. Works out there. I love consumerism in the economy. It's phenomenal. I hate consumerism inside the church. Why? Because it's a totally different reality. It's a way different words. Like God literally looks at us and goes, y'all do it. You guys do it together. Love one another. Your identity is someone who's being formed into someone who serves the Lord and serves other people. Here's why I know this about you. I know this about you because I know this about me. When it comes to who I'm becoming or the way that I'm formed, the primary question I often ask, even as a pastor, is what do I enjoy or like? What Peter is saying is that as followers of Jesus who are being formed by Jesus, we ought to ask the question, what does God enjoy or like? That's what he says. Offering spiritual sacrifices, what? Acceptable to who? Me? No. God. I wonder if you've ever thought and stopped, what does God enjoy? What does he like? When it comes to my family or the way that I work or live or what I do with my family, what does God enjoy? What does he like? I think too often as a follower of Jesus in the West, I think that asking the question to every encounter in my life, what do I enjoy, what do I enjoy, what do I like, what do I enjoy, what do I like, somehow will just make me look like Jesus, and the opposite is true. And then I go, Jesus, what's wrong with you? You don't seem to be very effective in my life. And he's like, have you thought about asking what I like and what I enjoy? Writing about this in his book on formation, author says this: the change of transformation that occurs in the believer's life happens best in the context of authentic community and is oriented as service toward where? Toward God and toward others. That as we come to Jesus, our identity is not about what I want, what I need, what I have to have, but it actually becomes more of what does God enjoy, who does he like, and where do we become. And that as I come to Christ, I begin to be made like him. If you would have walked up to an early church individual that Peter's writing, and you were a Roman or a Greek person, or even a Jewish person, you would have been so confused. You would have been like, hey guys, I hear you're new in the neighborhood. Tell me about your religion. And you'd be like, oh, well, Jesus, he's the Messiah. He died for us. Okay, do you guys have a temple? No, we don't have a temple. We kind of meet in some homes. Okay, no temple? Nope. Hey, tell me about your priestly caste. Oh, we don't have them. No priestly caste? Nope. Tell me what your altars look like. What are they made? Bronze, gold, silver? Did you get the new platinum version yet? I saw it's got some pretty nice wheels on the side. Just move it around. No, we don't have one of those. Okay. So you're a religion, right? Yeah. But you don't have priests. Nope. You don't have a place of worship. No fancy altars? No. Well, tell me, you got some idols, right? You got some graven images? Can I see you got a wallet-sized portrait of Jesus in a picture I can see? Nope, we don't have one of those either. Are you sure you're a religion? Like, what are you putting on your application if you don't have any priests or a temple or an altar or an idol? What do you got? Just Jesus, man. See, the Bible would tell us that Jesus became the temple, the place where God is met. You have to go to a building. You don't. You don't have to go to a specific place. There's no magic rock or stone oriented to the sky that you stand on and commune with. That's not how that works. It's Jesus. Jesus is where you meet God. He became the mediator, the high priest, the person who's in charge of relating to you and me. He was the sacrifice. Can you imagine that? Trying to explain that you don't have to sacrifice to people who have sacrificed their whole life. Yeah, no sacrifices, no mediator, no place. That's all Jesus. And by the way, he's the altar and he's the image of God. That's fascinating. And what Peter is saying is that as you come to Jesus, what happens is Jesus actually turns you into a place where God lives. And you're a temple. And then the high priest, Jesus, literally confers on you the ability to serve him and serve others. And that our life becomes the sacrifice. He is the ultimate sacrifice. Now my life becomes that sacrifice, just like his. And now what's crazy is even though he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, who's never ever been another, like only begotten, now somehow God's like making me into an image and reflection of him. It's crazy. So my life becomes a sacrifice and a temple and an altar. My family becomes an altar. I become like an image of God. What is that? That's called formation like Christ. So Peter is writing to you and me and saying, hey, we have the opportunity in a world of disintegration to come to Jesus and be formed into him. Why? Because we're so great? No, because Jesus came and died and rose to life so that we also too might walk and live in that life. And so as the band comes back up, I want to share one more thing with you. You are being formed, whether you like it or not. And what Peter is telling his people who are listening to the church, he's saying the followers of Jesus, they're just people who are responding in every area of their life to the reality of Jesus. And he goes, hey, this plays itself out in these three ways at least, if not more. And each one of those could be a whole nother sermon series, right? But he goes, by the way, you are responding to Jesus one way or the other. Again, there's no neutral ground. In fact, he quoted this part of the verse which we didn't really get into today, which kind of sounds weird. He's like, cornerstone, he's a stumbling block. What's with that? What's fascinating, there's a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Bonhoeffer was a follower of Jesus during the time of Hitler's rise to power in Germany. Bonhoeffer started a little community of education and actually spiritual formation. It was not impressive. Bonhoeffer invited those who were willing to come and live and learn, and they studied. And there's a story that's told of a friend of Bonhoeffer's who came and said, hey, can I look at what you're doing? Can I see what you're building? And he's like, yeah, here's our education wing, and it's like a room. Here's our library, and it's like 15 books. And here's what we're doing, and the friend just kind of listened to Bonhoeffer's vision, and he's like, man, dude, I think you're a little intense. Like maybe you dyed your hair a little crazy color, and what are you talking about? Why are you doing this? And Bonhoeffer famously took this friend, said, come with me, and he took him up to a hill, and he looked over the hill, and from where he was standing, he could see a German base and one of Hitler's troops that were beginning to amass. This is right before the war. And he could see the weapons and the troops that were doing drill and the Nazi flags that were flying. And Bonhoeffer looked at his friend and said, this, meaning his little Christian commune thing he's got going on, this has to be stronger than that. And he said it again. He's like, this has to be stronger than that. He's saying someone's going to form the future. Someone's going to form what's happening. I want that to be centered around Christ and not all of that. Now, what's fascinating is Peter quotes Isaiah 28. We don't have time. We're not going to go look at it real quick, but he quotes Isaiah 28 when he says, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Isaiah 28 is written to a people who were followers of God when an army was coming into their country. And this group of people, they were the leaders, the priests, the people who were in charge, and they were actually just enjoying the luxury, the food, the economy, the culture, everything that they had built. And they were ignoring what Isaiah was saying. And they were kind of relying on all that stuff. They were just kind of stuck in this world of like just enjoyment. And they're like, Isaiah's like, there's an army coming. God cares about that. He wants you to respond. And they're like, we've got plenty of stuff to enjoy our life with right here. And what's fascinating is that they began to mock Isaiah's words, the message that he had from God. And they start talking to him. They say, it's just a bunch of rules. And it's like, it's just like baby food. It's real simple. Doesn't have anything in my, look at my life. Look at what we have. We've got an army. We've got storehouses of grain. We've got money in the bank. We're going to parties. It's great. It's like what you're doing is like bottle feeding. We have no idea. We're not interested in that. So why do I bring that up? Well, because Peter takes those words and he flips it on its head. And here's what he says. At the very beginning, he says, as you, like newborn babes or infants longing for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if you indeed have tasted that the Lord is good. He's saying that thing that people were calling formula, that word that came from the Lord that they didn't want to be formed by, that thing they're like, He goes, no. That's life and growth. The question is whether or not you recognize it. And so they hear Isaiah's message and they go, that's just baby food. And he goes, oh yeah? Seemed to work in your life. And he looks at you and me in the midst of a culture with plenty of other things that will form and shape us. And he goes, the question is, do you understand? Do you understand what Jesus wants to do? Do you understand that his words are for your growth? And he says the thing that's going to make the difference is not necessarily how smart you are or how much money you have. It's whether or not you've tasted what God has to do in your life and you think it's good. Why? Because that has to be stronger than everything else out there. So I'm going to pray, and as I pray, just some of you maybe just starting to come to Jesus. You might not all the way be there, but you're moving, you've taken a step toward him. And what he's doing in your life may not feel great, and you're going, is this really doing anything? It seems kind of shallow and watered down. I don't know if I like it. And Peter would go, no, it's good. Have you tasted it's good? Come closer. Some of us, we might be going, actually, I kind of like some things and enjoy some stuff that it's not bad, it's just different, and it doesn't really affect me that much. And maybe for us, maybe for you, God's calling you this morning going like, hey, what is it that is forming you? Have you ever thought about that? And maybe some of you are sitting here and going like, I don't like who I am. I don't like what I've become. I don't like what I look like. And I'm just trying to like cover all that up and do everything else. And I don't know how to be not me. I don't know how to do that. Jesus died both so that you could be not you and also the real you. He died so that he might take all that stuff away, that sin and that brokenness, and that he actually might make you into what you were intended to be. The question is, do you trust him and do you think he's good? Let's pray. Father, I pray that as this morning we're here, we would not be first and foremost consumers, asking what we enjoy, but that we might ask what we might offer to you. God, I pray also that we might not be alone. Lord, I pray for the person who walked in this morning and they're trying to be shaped and formed in their life, and they're doing it as a solo project. God, may they find not only you this morning, but also others who are following you. God, I pray that we might come to you this morning, and even this morning as we come to you, not because you live in this space, not because we keep you in the back, but because you are everywhere, and you offer an invitation for everybody who's thirsty, come to you and drink water that never runs out. Or may we do that this morning. Shape us to look like you. Change our hearts. God, we want to be a community that you're building in a world that's falling apart. God, put us back together. In your son's name we pray. Amen.